event.
No, I like the idea of saying
I think we'll get there.
and I have to also throw in this meeting.
All right, hello everyone. Thank you all for coming out here tonight. My name is Julia. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm on the events team here at Books Are Magic. And it's so lovely to have you all here for an in-person event tonight. No, cheering's encouraged. Before we get started, I do just want to share some quick logistics. First off, we do ask that you keep your mask on at all times while at this event. We'll also be doing a hand-raised audience Q&A toward the end of the event, so start thinking of questions now. And then after the talk tonight, Jane is going to be signing and personalizing books at the desk over there where you came in. We'll also have additional books available to purchase. If you're joining us virtually on the YouTube live stream, I want to encourage you to buy a copy of the Verifiers online, and you can use the link in the live stream description. With all of that in mind, I'm very excited to introduce Jane Peck and Anna North, who are here celebrating the release of Jane's debut novel, The Verifiers. Woo! In this novel, we're introduced to Claudia Lynn, a young Asian American woman who, despite her parents' expectations of her, stumbles into a job at Veracity, a referrals-only online dating detective agency. When one of her clients goes missing, Claudia breaks the company protocol, starts investigating, and gets pulled into a mystery bigger than she could have expected. The Verifiers is truly a genre-blending feat. It combines the classic whodunit with an immigrant family story and even a dash of romance. It's an entirely original and entertaining mystery for the current moment. It's one I personally loved, and it tackles a question many of us have wondered. How much do we really know about the people we meet online? Jane Peck was born and grew up in Singapore. She holds a BA from Yale University, a JD from the New York University School of Law, and an MFA in fiction from Brooklyn College. Her short fiction has appeared in the Brooklyn Review, Witness, Conjunctions, Literary Hub, and twice in the Best American Short Stories. She currently lives in New York, where she works as a lawyer at a global investment company. And as mentioned, Jane is joined in conversation tonight by Anna North. Anna is a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop and the author of 3 novels, Outlawed, a New York Times bestseller, America Pacifica, and The Life and Death of Sophie Stark, which received a Lambda Literary Award in 2016. She has been a writer and editor at Jezebel, BuzzFeed, Salon, and the New York Times, and she's now a senior reporter at Vox. She grew up in Los Angeles and lives in Brooklyn. So without further ado, everyone please give a very warm welcome to Jane and Anna.
Okay, masks off. None of us know how to do this. This is on. This is on. Jane, is yours on?
Hello. I think mine is on.
Is mine on?
No.
I'm not
I
sure.
think the button should do it. There we go.
Hello. Okay. Jane, are you going to read to us a little bit?
Sure, I would be happy to read.
Thank you.
So I will say that I've been doing various virtual events, but so it's now really weird to see all of your faces looking back at me. But it's great. Thank you so much for coming. So I was thinking I'd read from the beginning of chapter 2, and I guess for people who haven't read the novel yet, in the first chapter we're introduced to Veracity, which is this online dating detective agency, and our protagonist, Claudia Lynn, has just joined, and a client comes in with a strange request, which is for Veracity to look into this guy who ghosted her online without ever meeting her in person. And so in the course of chapter 1, Claudia references her favorite fictional detective, Inspector Yuan, and thinks, what would Inspector Yuan do? So now I'm starting with chapter 2. There aren't too many things my mother and I can bond over. Braised chicken feet, poor hand-eye coordination, and Inspector Yuan. When I was a kid, she would tell me highly abridged versions of those stories until I fell asleep. usually as she stood beside the bed ironing her clothes for work the next day. Really, she deployed them as cannons to blast forth key Confucian values of filial piety, hard work, filial piety, honesty, and, oh right, filial piety. Everyone who got killed had neglected their elderly mother or cheated her of a family heirloom. And each story ended with Inspector Yuan visiting his parents with gifts and thanking them for all the sacrifices they made for him. When I started reading the books for myself, borrowing the English translations at the library, I was shocked to discover that in the author's actual conception of the Inspector Yuan universe, the man is an orphan. If nothing else, Inspector Yuan gives me something safe to talk about with my mother. Whenever I visit her in Flushing, which is way less often than I should, filial impiety, shame, I make sure to be reading an Inspector Yuan mystery I know she has already read, so she can spoil it for me the way she delights in doing. My sister, Caroline, likes to say the fact that our mother even bothered with any kind of bedtime story for me proves I'm her favorite. Also the fact that I slept in my mother's room until our brother, Charles, went off to college, which is when Caroline moved into his room and I got to move into the converted closet that had been hers. Charles and Caroline think it's oh so hilarious that I was living in the closet. I tell Caroline she's just suffering from middle child syndrome and she's crazy if she thinks my having zero privacy until the age of 10 was a sign of favor. The thing is, I suspect Caroline is right in the just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they aren't after you kind of way. And what I can never say to her is, so what? I'm still not enough for our mother. Like Caroline isn't, and Charles isn't, and all of us combined can never be. If my mother could go back to when she was 26, stepping off the plane and into the grey holding pen of JFK, achy and befuddled by the 30-hour flight from Taipei and the enormity of her isolation in this strange land where the only person she knew was a husband of 2 months, I'm certain she would make a run for it. Through baggage claim, through the arrivals hall teeming with migrants carting along the bags and boxes into which they had stuffed all their hopes and fears and misconceptions about America, out onto the sidewalk and into a cab she couldn't afford. Away from the man who would otherwise avalanche their savings into his dumbass business ventures and smash things up when he was drunk, and occasionally her as well, who would finally disappear, leaving a note saying that he fed the dog. Away from the 3 children who would otherwise tyrannize her with their weakness and their need. She would hurl herself for a chance at a life where she could make things happen, instead of one where things happen to her. On Friday after work, I bike from Veracity's offices in Tribeca to Flushing, where we're celebrating Charles's 33rd birthday. It's a 90-minute ride past waste treatment plants and under the oceanic roar of the BQE, slipstreaming behind cement mixers and trailer tractors that suck at sharing the road. While I ride, I breathe in exhaust and consider Iris Litrist. She's my first case, I suspect because Bex thinks maintaining a spreadsheet of Charity's online activity is too menial for her. I'll take it though. Until now, I've just been reading industry magazines like Datebook and The Match, and setting up what Bex calls training profiles. The latter feels like a Sisyphean Mad Libs exercise that still goes on long after I've run out of entertaining ideas. I am a blank who likes blank and is looking for blank. Here are 3 quirky / fun / surprising things about me. If I were a type of blank, I would be a blank. On and on. Before I can work on actual cases, says Bex, I must familiarize myself with all the dating platforms Veracity provides coverage of. More than 4 dozen, even though so far every single client I've met has been on one of the big 3 matchmakers. She's probably just seeing if she can break me. To me, what's interesting about Iris's case isn't whether Charité lied or why he ghosted Iris. In matching land, people do both all the time, often in quick succession. Whenever Max gets forlorn about his latest perfect match AWOLing, I remind him of the universally acknowledged truth that a single person in possession of a superlative dating profile must not be lying about anything. However, why does Iris want to know, and so badly? That, in my opinion, informed by a lifetime spent in the company of Holmes, Poirot, Maigret, and Yearn, is the real mystery.
Thank you so much. That was awesome. And also thank you again to everybody for being here. This is so cool. I'm excited that we get to actually see people in real life. So as you were talking, I was wishing that I made a question about West Elm Caleb, but maybe like there's still time, like while you answer the ones that I do have, I'll think of one. But first I have just a really basic question, which is, can you talk a little bit about what the germ of the story was for you? How did you first come to this idea?
Okay, sure. Yeah, so I think the germ of the idea was, what if there was an online dating detective agency that verified people's profiles? And I'll say that I think at the time that I came up with this idea, I had been online dating for a while, and I should say that I had a very positive experience, as my long-suffering wife can attest to. But I think just kind of going through all of that kind of made me think about how online dating affects and changes the traditional ways that we conduct romance and how we think about how we meet people and what we're looking for. And then, of course, very much tied into that are questions around truthfulness and about how we present ourselves to the world, especially in a time when so much of what people see of us is mediated by online profiles and personas, and so much of our interactions are virtual or electronic. And so I think that's kind of where I started from, this idea of this agency, and then I had to figure out what I was going to do with it.
That makes me think about, so another question that I had was about the online dating world in this book.
Yeah.
I'm curious how much research you did on online dating and how exaggerated is this world? There are parts of the book that are very funny about dating sites that I don't think exist, but then also the website seecaptaindate.com exists in real life. So talk to me about how exaggerated is this world where there are these online dating empires.
Yeah, so I think I was clear that I did want to create a fictional online dating landscape, and I think it was because part of what I wanted to look at through this particular online dating set of technologies that we use is the question of how we use technologies in our personal and social lives, how much we rely on them, how much information we end up providing to the tech companies in the course of using these services, and in turn how that affects things such as the choices that we make or the way that we interact with people and all of that. And so I knew that in this online dating world that I created, I wanted things to be very data driven, and for us to look at this idea that how could these tech companies then use this data to try and better predict what we might or might not do. In terms of research, I think I'll say I did do a bit of reading into the algorithms that online dating platforms use and how those have evolved, and also in connection with just bigger questions around all predictive algorithms more generally, how Netflix recommends to you, what you will watch next based on what they know of what you have seen and what other people who are like you have seen and liked. And then, I bugged all my friends who were still online dating to, constantly update me on their experiences. But, none of that made it into the book. At least the friends who are here in this audience. None of them.
Got it. I have more questions about online dating and the surveillance state, but I also want to talk just for a second about genre, because I think one of the things I like so much about your book is the way that it plays with different genres, and also is very sort of deep and literary as it plays with all of them. And so one question I had for you is just, you talk about Claudia being so steeped in all these different famous detectives. Are you steeped in that way? Like, were you a mystery fan before you started this? How does this book engage with mystery?
So I think I'll say, I mean, I do enjoy reading mysteries, and I did grow up reading, especially I think Agatha Christie and Arthur Conan Doyle. I think my favorite is Poirot. But I think I'm not like really like deep into mystery, I think, as a genre. My personal favorite actually is fantasy and science fiction. But I think when I started writing this book, I always liked the idea of the character of the detective. And I think that's something that comes up even in a lot of literary fiction, like Jorge Luis Borges or Haruki Murakami. They have this idea of a character who's a detective. And I like the idea of a detective agency and the idea of like there being mysteries that could be solved. And so when I started this book, I think for the longest time it wasn't like a murder mystery. I think I had the idea for the agency, and then I was like, oh, okay, they're detectives, and so they need to solve mysteries. And then I was like trying to think up of mysteries that they could solve, and it was like at first they were kind of like quieter mysteries, like, oh, why would someone lie about this thing about themselves, or why would someone cheat on their partner? But there wasn't really enough of a narrative engine. And so finally I was like, okay, fine, I will kill someone. That will provide the plot, because then they will have to find out how that person got killed. But I think even so, I kind of like worked my way into how this novel ended up being like, on one level, I mean, I think some people have compared it to like a techno thriller, and then also like the idea of it kind of playing with the tropes of the murder mystery, and then also just kind of trying to put in the type of, I think, character development that I feel like kind of, quote unquote standard literary fiction does. Yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah, I mean, I no longer know what is standard literary fiction. I feel like in a good way that boundary feels like it's breaking down more and more. And I definitely feel like this, sort of rides that boundary in super interesting ways. I want to talk about Claudia a little bit. Claudia Lynn, she has such a strong presence. She's so funny. She has this like, a little bit of a sadness about her, but is sort of like funny and brash and bikes around the city. How did you kind of get into the headspace to write her? And did you have like other characters or even other detectives who were sort of informing her as you wrote?
Yeah, so Claudia is interesting because I definitely feel like her voice is what drives the novel. And I think that's why I think also that's why it's as funny as it is, in the sense that like she has like a funny voice, like the person that she is. But I think, and it surprised people when I said this who had read the book, but Claudia actually didn't appear until like kind of the very final iteration of the book, like right before I sent it out to agents and found my wonderful agent. So I think for years I was actually writing the book with a different protagonist.
Who was the
in my-
protagonist? Can you tell us?
I mean, I think it was just like, so I guess, okay, so backtracking a bit, I think when I started writing this book, I always knew that I wanted the protagonist to be gay, because I think growing up I never read those types of books, or even if I did, those were not people who were the main characters, like the ones having the adventures and falling in love and everything. But then I hesitated a bit about making the character also Asian American. And I think it was just like, it felt like, oh, maybe it's a bit too close, and and so for the longest time my character was not. But I think then I ran into a bit of a roadblock, because I couldn't fully understand her backstory and how she would move through the world, and how that would inform the ways that she thinks and acts. And so I actually had a bit of an epiphany after I watched Crazy Rich Asians, because I felt like one thing about Crazy Rich Asians is that it was just like a romantic comedy. Like, it wasn't like an Asian story. It was just a story and everyone could enjoy it. And so I was like, okay, let me do that. And then I just like basically started from page 1 again, and then just rewrote the whole thing using like Claudia. And once I came to that conclusion, it actually, like, her voice and everything just kind of came together really quickly. And I felt like I knew like what someone like her would think and how she would act, and I put in a bunch. I mean, I also cycle around the city and I love food and things like that and books. So I did put in a bunch of my interests, but you know, I'm definitely not Claudia.
I love that. It's such a good feeling when you sort of unlock something, when you're like, oh no, this is never gonna work, this is never gonna work, and you're like, oh wait, I just changed this one thing, and then suddenly, except the one thing is like the entire voice of the main character, I guess, but it also sounds like then it flowed for you like fairly easily after that.
Yeah, no, definitely. It felt very different. Like, and I think like things that people had said about earlier versions of the book was that the the protagonist felt just kind of like a stand-in, like a placeholder, or just like not really a distinctive person. And I felt like that definitely changed once I switched people. Yeah.
Yeah, I love her. I can't imagine anyone else being the star of this book. And when you were talking, that also made me think of another question that I had, which is that, you know, this is a mystery with a queer heroine at its center, and it has some queer romance elements. You kind of mentioned that you didn't have a lot of models for that growing up. I'm curious if there are more models now, if there are books that you think of, or even if you have like compatriots, other books that you've read, you know, since starting this one that sort of have that same kind of queer mystery element.
Yeah, I actually do, and that is something that has been really cool and refreshing. And I mean, I got to a point where I was like, oh wow, I might never need to read a straight love story again. But I feel like especially in genre, I think that's happening a lot. And like for instance, a few years ago, I read Who is Vera Kelly by Rosalie Knash, and I thought that was great. It was like, you know, like a closeted lesbian who was also a CIA spy during the Argentine Revolution. And I was like, wow, it's great to see books like that. And I think, especially in science fiction too, like I've read a bunch of science fiction novels that have just had their protagonists, you know, like be gay or be like, you know, unconventional in that way. And it's like, that's not what the story is about in a sense. It's just that is who they are. And that is actually what I really love, is that, you know, that this is just who the character is. And so that informs everything about them, but it's not about that aspect of their identity.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like we're really seeing genre like lead on that in certain ways. And it's been cool to see. Can we talk about crime? So I think there's been this really interesting discourse in the last couple years about true crime, and also about like cop shows, you know, and especially with you know, questions about like what are the police for and should they exist? Questions about like what is the role of like the cop on a cop show? What is the role of the police in a detective story? And I think the Verifiers kind of like, you know, neatly gets around that, because your character is not a cop. You know, she's an amateur detective. This is like sort of like almost all exists like outside of the world of law enforcement. But was that conscious? And like, just tell me a little bit of, like, how do you think about writing? It's not exactly crime fiction, but it is murder fiction.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you bring that up, because I think when I was thinking about the crime, I did know that I didn't want the police involved, and for like a number of reasons. Like, I didn't want to get into the details of like forensics and all that. I didn't want it to be a police procedural. I didn't want to, you know, get into all that those aspects of it. Even though, like, for instance, I love Tana French and I love her Dublin Murder Squad stories. So then I think kind of I structured the crime based on that, in that I needed to come up with a crime that the police wouldn't think was a crime, so then they would leave it alone. And I needed it to be solved in a way that didn't need any resort to police methods. And so based on those two things, that was how I ended up with the way that the person died and how it was eventually, I guess, found out.
That makes sense. I mean, that leads into another question that I had, which was just about like craft, like how you know, I'm being selfish here because I'm working on something that has like a little bit of a mystery element, but I think it's also just like one of the things that like in this book feels really effortless, but also as a writer feels like it must be really hard. Like, talk about like how much of the end did you know at the beginning? How much did you map it out? Like, how do you set up a mystery for the reader so that it looks effortless in this way?
I'm really glad you thought it looked effortless, because it took so much effort. That's, you know, I think my editor knows. I will say I'm not an author who outlines, possibly to my own detriment. And so for like the longest time, I think I was just writing chronologically and trying to figure out what was going to happen next. I think there was a period of time when the resolution was vaguer in that they knew what had happened, but they didn't really pin it to an individual. And then I think that also didn't really work because felt like you kind of needed more resolution to that. And then for a time, like the villain was someone else, and then I was trying that out too, and I was like, oh, it doesn't feel right. So, I mean, I think at the end of the day, it was kind of going to the end with those various other versions and realizing that it didn't work, and then kind of working backwards a bit to be like, oh, okay, so maybe this is who I want to be the villain, and then kind of setting up why they would want to do something like that. But yeah, no, that was the hardest part, I think, of writing this novel, was figuring out the murder mystery. And I think especially too because given the genre, like, it's really important to have the discovery of who did it and why and how the detective finds that out to be both surprising and satisfying. And so then you kind of need to set up something that is clever, but then you also need the detective to figure it out in a clever way when no one else did. And yeah, that was just really hard.
Yeah, that's really hard. Did you read other mysteries while you were writing it, or did you swear off and be like, I'm not gonna like have my mind be compromised by this?
Yeah, so I actually did read, and I think I started reading more mysteries actually because I felt like I should get a sense of what kind of both the classic writers and contemporary writers were doing. So I actually did start reading Tana French in the course of this, and I also started reading Kate Atkinson, her Jackson Brodie series, and I think the Jackson Brodie ones are more kind of unconventional in terms of how they figure out like what happened. But then I also read kind of a bunch of the classic writers, and especially those who did more of like the locked room mysteries or like the quote unquote perfect mysteries. And, like I think after a while maybe you see some patterns, and then, like, I don't know if I actually applied any of them to the novel, but it was just like interesting to think about.
That makes sense. Yeah, I've been thinking about going back and rereading all of Sherlock Holmes. Yeah. I have this like giant, my parents' house, I have this like collected book that's like this tall, so we'll see.
Like slowly
go through the whole thing. Can you talk a little bit about, to what extent do you feel like this is a coming of age novel? I was doing the math as you're reading. I was like doing the math about how old is Claudia, and I've seen her in reviews referred to both as a millennial heroine and as a Gen Z heroine.
Oh my God.
I had thought of her as totally millennial, but maybe that's because I'm an old millennial. She's younger than me. But just tell me, like, I think she feels like really adult in this book. Like, she's very like capable, like she's confident in a lot of ways, but she also grows a lot. Like, how much did you think of this as a coming of age story?
Yeah, no, I'm glad that occurred to you because I love coming of age stories, and I always felt like I would want to write one. I feel like it is to some extent. I think not the same way when you're like 18 or 21, but definitely I think she grows up quite a bit. I think in my mind, like, I do think of Claudia as a millennial, but I think it's a function of when I started the novel and then the passage of time. Like, and then in the course of it, I was like, oh crap, at a certain point you can't call her a millennial anymore, even though, like, to me she's just like 25, but then I was also a bit intentionally hazy, I think, about when the novel takes place because I didn't want to date it too much. Because I was afraid that then, then, like, if it took 3 years to publish a book, then I would have to switch generations or something. But yeah, no, to me she's definitely a millennial.
Okay, good, I feel validated. I have a couple more questions and then I'm going to turn it over to you all. But first, I want to talk about food. This is something that I know you've talked about in interviews, but talk a little bit about it here. Talk about the role of food in the book. You mentioned that like eating food and cooking food is a really important part of your process. Just talk about, how does food inform your writing? How did it inform the book?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess I feel like I need to be constantly eating when I write. So a lot of my time that is spent writing is spent in the kitchen, thinking about writing as I prepare my food. But I mean, and I obviously love food, and I think kind of part of what was fun for me about this novel was kind of putting in, all the different kind of types of foods that we have access to in New York, and that she can like cycle to. and I think that was just part of like New York color for me. Um, yeah, so it's yeah, I guess that is all.
So it's like part of the setting almost.
Yeah.
That makes sense. I also wanted to talk about cycling. My husband is a big bike cyclist, and like
Yeah.
real transit obsessive. And so I really noticed, that that's how she gets around the city. It
Yeah.
becomes this real way that you map the action. And it sounds like you're a cyclist also. How did that? Do you think about riding when you bike? Like how did your like biking time inform like how you map out this book, like in space?
Yeah, so I think I came up with the idea of the protagonist being a cyclist because in a very much earlier version there was a scene where she was trailing someone and then he got into a car and then she was like, oh, on my bike I can be faster than him, and so it was really a comment on New York traffic was what it was. But I think I really like the idea of having her be a cyclist because I feel like it's a way of seeing New York, I think, and of kind of having New York be a part of the novel that I haven't read that much of. And I also just love like that physicality of cycling, and I feel like I never feel more alive when I'm like on the streets of New York, like about to be like run over by a truck or something. And yeah, so then I just felt like, and also just given the nature of the novel where she's like moving around the city, like kind of like I guess watching people and like following them, then I felt like kind of if she was on a bike, like that just allowed for more of like the environment to come in as opposed to if she was just on the subway or something like that. And I think it's also like a realistic way for her to actually get around all of the different neighborhoods in the time that she does.
It is often faster than driving. Awesome. And then I also want to talk a little bit about her family. I think like the way that you weave in her backstory and the way that you make her family like crucial characters in this book is really deft. And talk a little bit of just how does her family history and some of the hard things that have happened with her family, how does that both kind of define her and not define her?
Yeah. So I think with a family, like I kind of wanted to create a complicated family, and I myself am one of three siblings, and I really like that dynamic when you have three siblings, and I feel like with every set of siblings you always have like kind of complicated interactions, like you have the rivalry and you have like maybe you have some resentment, but then you also have affection, and that's all bound up in the way that you interact with each other and then also with the way that you interact with your parents. So I think with that family, I wanted to kind of show a certain kind of vulnerability that Claudia had, and I wanted to show like an example of how when I asked that question of what does it mean to know someone, in some ways, even though her siblings are the closest to her, there are things that she doesn't know about them that she discovers in the course of the book, and I think her relationships with them kind of change as well. I think I also did want to explore a bit this idea of like the immigrant experience and the idea that her mother is a first-generation immigrant, whereas she's a second-generation immigrant, and there's a kind of a bit of a cultural divide, which I kind of feel that way a bit with my own mother. So I'm a first generation, and she's in Singapore, and that can kind of be played for humor sometimes, which I do in the book. But I do also think there's kind of an additional layer of translation maybe, and this sense of a divide when I think a parent realizes that their children are not in the same place as they are, that they're just somewhere else, someplace else, and that there cannot be that perfect understanding. And then I think otherwise it was, I feel like family is very important to her, and it's one of those where I think she comes to discover a bit more, I think, how important it is in the course of the book. But I think it was always very clear to me that part of what makes her like kind of act and think the way she does is how she was brought up and what her family is like.
That makes sense. That's awesome. Yeah, I think the scenes with her family are some of my favorites in the book. I think they're really wonderful. Okay, I'm going to ask one more question, then I'll turn it over to you folks. But sometimes writers hate talking about this, so feel free to sidestep. But just what are you thinking about working on next? You know, what's your, where is your mind like tending right now? You can even just be like, I'm writing essays for this book and it's taking me forever, because that's usually my answer.
Yeah, which is true. So I will say, I mean, I would say I would love to write a sequel to this. I feel like, and I think part of that is maybe my own upbringing in genre fiction as well. But, you know, I love the idea of a series, and I love the idea of like, kind of books and growing with the characters, and especially I think with these characters, like I can see their journeys continuing on. I, you know, have also been like working on another novel which is just kind of separate, and has more of a science fiction angle, and kind of picks up on the themes of technology that this novel deals with, but more in the direction of like virtual reality and AI, and how that affects our conceptions of what it means to be human. And part of how I came up with that idea was because I would really love to write a Chinese sword fighting story, because I love that. But it's really hard to do that in our contemporary age, because once you have guns, I mean, you know, like there's no need to use swords. But so then I thought, oh, what if I wrote a story where, you know, there was a, like you could write virtual reality historical worlds. So then once you went into
It's like
that
a holodeck.
deal, exactly, then you would have to, you know, use whatever weapons. And so in the story, it's just kind of like, you know, the idea of a writer of like these virtual reality worlds, and then someone goes missing in one of the worlds that she wrote, and so she has to go in to find them. So it's a bit of a heist, like assembling a team. But then when she goes in there, she discovers, of course, bigger conspiracy than she thought, and etc.
I love that. I want to pre-order that. Awesome. Well, I feel like you must have wonderful questions too. So you'll raise hands, and then I'm going to try to remember to repeat your question so that the folks watching on YouTube will also be able to hear it. And I have more. If you don't, so that's a threat.
It's kind of a massive buildup, but so as newer writers or screenwriters ourselves, and you talked about like you don't usually map things out, and you got to the end, and then you had to like rewrite a couple times. I'm just curious, you know, you have a full-time job outside of writing, right? How did you stay motivated, or like did you set goals for yourself? I'm just curious about that process a little bit.
Cool. So the question is basically, with a full-time job, how did you stay motivated? What was your sort of process like day to day? I think, right? Is that good?
Yeah, I mean, I think I won't deny that at certain points it was challenging, because it did take me several years, kind of from beginning to end, to write this book. I think at the end of the day, I mean, it was just the conviction that the idea that I had was good, and that it was something that people would be interested to read. And then it was just a matter of, yeah, like kind of continuing to work on it, and kind of moving closer to what I felt like I wanted the product to be. And I think that it was definitely helpful that at certain points it did feel like there were breakthroughs, like for instance when I realized who the protagonist should be, that really helped. And then I think also, you know, a lot of brainstorming with my wife, who, you know, is my trusted reader, because she'll tell me when something doesn't work. You know, like kind of talking through things with her over and over again, just kind of like really figuring out, okay, so this makes sense, this doesn't make sense, what about this? And then, you know, over time, kind of translating that to words on the page. And then that was how eventually I got there.
Awesome. Other questions? In the back.
You shared with us that you work as a lawyer. I know nothing about practicing law, but I imagine that's very intricate work. And Claudia's work in the novel, too, is quite intricate. So I wondered if you took anything from your experience working in law into the book.
That was also a question I had. The question for YouTube folks is just, did you take anything from your experience working in law into this book?
Yeah, and so I have a couple of lawyer friends in the audience. But you know, for you guys who haven't read it, there is an overworked mergers and acquisitions lawyer in the novel who works at a big law firm. Not at all based on my personal experiences. But, so I will say that, that I think I did take some of that in terms of just characters and like kind of and like characters who were lawyers and all that. But I think also another aspect of the novel that was informed by my legal work was around like the ideas of data collection and privacy and what kinds of consents kind of we give in order to use these types of services. And then also I think there were aspects of the novel that dealt with mergers and acquisitions or private equity, and those were definitely just informed by my understanding of that particular corporate world.
That's great. Other questions? Julie.
As a debut novelist, what has surprised you the most about being published, the whole process?
Question is, what has surprised you the most about being published?
I think actually this book promotion stuff.
It's different this time. It's different in the pandemic.
That's my next question is for you, how it's different.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I had always known that this would be important, but you know, I feel like doing all of these events and just kind of getting the book out into the world is just, I guess when I had thought about being a writer, I hadn't thought about this part of it. But now we're here, and I'm really grateful to be here. So, yeah.
Anna, what's different about having just published a book yourself during a pandemic, which is not your first novel, so you've seen it both ways?
Question is, what is different about publishing a novel in the pandemic? I mean, not to flatter our hosts here, but I've been so impressed with how bookstores have responded. I remember Julie, so Jane and I share an agent, Julie, who's you can't see, I think, if you're on YouTube. And I remember we had a call in April 2020, and I had a book coming out in early 2021. And it was a really sad call. You were talking about how so many bookstores were going to go under and it was going to be such a disaster. And bookstores did go under, but I was just so impressed with the way that they pivoted and just with the incredible support for writers and with the way that Zoom events went. I don't know, it feels really good to be physically in a bookstore now, and I'm so glad that we are getting to do this. But I guess that's a way in which it's not different. But it was the way that they supported us was really different. Bookstore Instagram accounts became really important, and Instagram in general I felt became really important. So and bookstores became these fulfillment operations where they were shipping out to everywhere in the country. Yeah, I don't know. So there were a lot of changes, but also some of the fundamentals feel kind of similar to me. And I'm glad your book is coming out at a time when you get to do these. That's really great.
Yeah, no, I feel like I really lucked out here in terms of timing. Yeah.
Do we have other questions from the room? I have one more if you guys don't, but I would love to hear from you. This is not the one, but is there anything that you wish that I or someone had asked that we didn't ask?
Oh. No, it was great.
Okay, this is my one more for realsies, which is, do you think online dating is a villain in this book? So I know you met your wife online. I actually met my husband online on OkCupid.
Oh, me too.
Yeah. Oh wow.
Yeah.
That's funny. I always feel very dorky or something.
Oh no, I embraced it a long time ago.
But yeah, what is your feeling about the evilness or not evilness of these platforms?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question because I think I am a bit torn on that. Because I do think that on one level, maybe online dating makes finding someone a bit less romantic. But then on the other hand, I also feel like it gives us the opportunity to meet so many more people than we otherwise would. And I think part of what I enjoyed about it was that even when there wasn't a romantic connection, you were just getting to meet a cool person and finding about who they were and having a conversation. And I do think that there is value in just kind of opening your horizons in terms of who you might meet. One idea that I've been interested in thinking about, which would be for a future Verifiers book if it did happen, was actually, like, I feel like in this book, maybe I say that, well, maybe the online dating platforms are not actually that good at predicting compatibility. But I think another interesting question would be, what if they were? Then in that case, you know, would we want to surrender our own like choices to the choice of the algorithm that can actually tell you this is the best match for you? And that is a question that I do not know where I fall on that.
That is kind of chilling. I want it to be dealt with more in Verifiers too, which I'm very excited for. Thank you so much, everybody. I think we're going to hear some more from the bookseller about how you can buy and have these books signed.
Yeah, thank you. Just gonna pop in for another very brief moment. Want to remind everyone that Jane is going to be signing books at the desk back there where you all came in. We'll give her a moment to get settled in, but then you can feel free to start lining up. And if you feel so moved after this wonderful conversation, we do have additional copies for sale at the desk as well. And I just want to give one last thank you to everyone for joining us, both in person and virtually. And another really big thank you to Jane and Anna for such a wonderful conversation. So let's close out this event with a huge round of applause.